It's time to learn about the Industrial Revolution, which, in a nutshell, is basically where we went from making goods by hand in our own homes to making goods by machines in very large factories. And to help us understand this, we're going to get some help from our friend, the unicorn. Don't understand? Oh, don't worry. You soon will. So the Industrial Revolution begins in the mid 1700s into the 1800s, and it begins in Britain for a number of reasons. First has to do with your food supply. Before you can industrialize, you have to make sure you have an adequate food supply. Now, in Britain, you may remember in the medieval period, we talked about the three field system, right? That's where you divide the land up into three, and then you only grow food on 2/3 of the land. 1/3 of the land you leave alone. You let it rest for a year. That way the land can get back in its nutrients. The following year, you would use that land and let a different field rest, and so on and so forth. And that works. But by definition, you're only using 2/3 of the land. In addition, during this period, they also had something known as the common pasture area. You may recall the common pasture area just was a big open space where if you're raising animals, they have an area. You don't have to worry about using your farmland. You can use that to have the animals graze and what have you. All right, what ends up happening is this system goes away. First, you have something known as the enclosure law. With the enclosure law, you literally close off the land. Now you're starting to have small tenant farmers who are they're limited to a very small plot of land. And on that small plot of land, they have to be able to grow enough food for themselves, for their family, and graze any animals that they have, so on. Anyway, long story short, for the small peasant farmers, this is terrible. They can't make it. So they have to give up their land. They can't make this work. They can no longer be farmers. They have to find another job. And what you end up being left with is instead of like lots of little farms, you're left with very large plots of land. And this works out because for the wealthy people of the area, they're able to take this land, and a lot of them end up using it as grazing space for cattle. They end up making more money grazing cattle than they do for farms. Or you're left with large farms that now you can run more efficiently. You can run it smarter, and you can start using new tools and new technologies to make the land more productive. So it's during this period that we have what's called an agricultural revolution. And the agricultural revolution, one aspect of it is something known as crop rotation. Now, remember when I talked about the three field system? You use 2 fields, you leave one alone. Crop rotation doesn't work like that. In crop rotation, you use all of the land all of the time. The way it works is that certain plants pull certain nutrients out of the soil and deposit other nutrients. So they, keep certain stuff and they leave other stuff behind. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You guys aren't farmers. You're not going to use this, but get the idea. Long story short, you can see in the picture, see the cabbage family, bean family, potato family, root and onion family. You can't grow the same crop on the same land year after year. So as long as you change what you're growing on the land, you can keep the land fertile. Okay? So that's part of it. Another part of this agricultural revolution is new technology. So, for example, you can see this is a seed drill. And now, think about it. Instead of having to, use your ox and your cow to, open up the land and then later come by with your seeds and drop them in as a separate step, now you can have this one machine where it does everything in one shot. You crack open the land, you drop your seeds, bang, bang, boom, you're done. Now, what happens is if you have a tiny piece of land, you're not going to invest in this kind of technology. It's too expensive. It's too much of a pain. It's easier to it doesn't make that big of a difference to just do it by hand. But when you have larger farms, now something like this makes a lot of sense. So things like the reaper, the mechanical reaper, the seed drill, all these new technologies, these larger farms start using these technologies. They get the work done faster. And they also need fewer workers, which also keeps costs low. You have less people working on the farm, and you're getting the farm work done faster, okay, and more efficiently. So what ends up happening is the same amount of land produces more food. And whenever you have a bump in food, whenever you have more food production, the population goes up as well. People are living longer, they're healthier, they're able to have more kids. And the kids are able to survive because you got enough food. But at the same time that your population is growing, the need for agricultural workers is dropping. So what are these people going to do? They can't sit around the farms anymore and be farmers. There's just no jobs for them. So naturally, they end up flooding the cities. And that brings us to number 2, which is workers. If you're going to have an industrial revolution, you need people to work in the businesses. And that's what you end up happening. You have all these people who used to be farmers, these former agricultural workers, flooding into the cities, desperate for work. And you can see the population growth is insane. Manchester alone, in 40 years, look, it's 1801 to 1841. That's 40 years. And you have over 300,000 additional people. Dude, nobody has 300,000 kids in 40 years. You can't. Do the math. That doesn't happen. The only way you get that kind of jump is through a huge amount of immigration, a lot of people moving into the city. And of course, as you can see, this has followed Leeds, Birmingham, Sheffield, all the big cities in England. You see the same thing. Now, this process where people start leaving the countryside and start leaving farmland and instead move to the city, there's a specific word for that, and it's known as urbanization. Urbanization. Urban means city. So urbanization is the growth of your cities. All right, next is inventions. Obviously, we already talked about the seed drill and the mechanical reaper, so we've already had new technology introduced to farms. We're also going to see other new technologies developed during this period. So, for example, this is the steam engine. This is the Bessemer process that you can use to make steel. This is the power loom. But in addition to power loom, you had the spinning jenny. For Britain, the textile industry was very, very important. In addition, don't just look at the machines, which is the power loom. You can also look at where it's located. If you look around, you start to see the rise of factories. This is a new thing. Usually work was done at home or, on a small scale. But now you have these huge, huge businesses where all these people come in and do their work. All right, next is raw materials. So oddly enough, one of the best things that Britain has that allows for the Industrial Revolution, especially in its early days, is the location of rivers. Now, usually you think of rivers as like a water source or maybe transportation, but it also can be a power source when you use a water wheel. As long as the water is moving and it can move the wheel, this is a big power source, especially in Britain in the early days. They used this to power a lot of the textile mills in the early days. So in addition to rivers, another fuel source that you're going to have is, of course, the steam engine. And what happens is to make a steam engine work, you need a particular raw material. So as you can see, you need to build a fire to make a steam engine work. And again, when it came to raw materials, Britain was actually in a really sweet spot. Obviously, if you start trying to use wood for fires, you're going to run out of forests. You can't cut down a 100-year-old tree and then, think it's going to, pop back in 20 years. Especially if you're a tiny island nation like Britain. You don't have massive forests you can cut down. But instead, Britain has coal. And that burns hotter and longer. So coal ends up being one of the most important fuel sources for the Industrial Revolution. Now, I should note, coal also is dirty as heck. When you burn it, it creates a lot of pollution. And actually, this is one of the reasons why today, when we have global warming and climate change, a lot of people trace it back to the Industrial Revolution, because by burning so much coal, it put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. All right, so Britain has a lot of rivers, it has a lot of coal, and the other raw material it has in great abundance, that's very important, is iron ore. All right. Now, if you take a look at this map, what you'll see is that these patches, those dark patches, that's where the coal is. The squares are where the iron ore is. So what ends up happening is it's cheaper and easier. Instead of moving coal and iron ore to where the people are, you move the people to where the coal and the iron ore are. So that's why you start to see the cities grow up right where the coal and iron is, because that's what you're going to be using in your factories. And so as you can see with those black triangles, you're getting cities of 100,000 to 300,000 people. This is leading to more urbanization. Now, in addition to the raw materials that Britain has in its own lands, remember, Britain also has colonies. You may remember our discussion of the British East India Company. It's going to start taking power away from the Mughal Empire, and it's really going to start dominating that country. And so it's able to get its hands on raw materials produced in India. There's also, remember, colonies in the Americas. You remember our discussion about the sugar plantations. They're growing, they're growing all types of things. In addition, Britain has a very strong trading relationship with America. Now, you should know America produced cotton. We were one of the largest producers of cotton, and we were able to produce cotton, a lot of it for very cheap, is thanks to slave labor. So that was, of course, part of it as well. Now, when it comes to these colonies, at this time, America's not a colony anymore. We're a trading partner. But nonetheless, when it comes to colonies, don't forget about our discussion of mercantilism. Mercantilism, you remember, mercantilism is where the mother country gets all the money because it controls manufacturing. This is part of it, where you are the trading relationship is set up so that the colony produces the raw materials, but the wealth generated really is directed at the mother country. It's going to be directed at Britain, and Britain is going to be much richer. Another idea that I want to introduce to you is the idea of cash crops. What ends up happening is in the, before colonization, if you're an independent person, living your life, you grow food, you grow crops that take care of your own personal needs, and that serves the local market, okay? This changes once you start having colonies, and with the Industrial Revolution, this just catches on and gets greater, is what we call cash crops. Instead of growing what you need or what your local community needs, you start growing crops specifically so that they can be sold. So you are growing crops that you will not use, you will not need, and you are growing them just so they can be sold somewhere else for the benefit usually of the mother country, of the colonial power. What ends up happening is the switch to cash crops very often leads to famine. And we're going to look, one of the big victims of this is Ireland. And we're going to take a look at the Irish potato famine in a future lesson. All right, money. Now, you may remember we talked about the commercial revolution. We talked about that again at the tail end, that Renaissance period. And we talked about the new ways that business is being done, that you're starting to see more and more banks. You're starting to see the rise of joint stock companies. You're starting to look at new financial instruments being created and invented, insurance companies, what have you. Now that started, with the rise of towns and cities, with greater trade, with greater exploration. But those same tools, those same financial tools can now be used to allow for industrialization. Next, transportation. So we already talked about rivers. So we have natural rivers that cut through Britain, and we were talking about them when we talked about it with the water wheel. But again, rivers also work as transportation. In addition to rivers, what they start to also build are canals. You can think of a canal as like a man-made river. You dig the hole so you can run your boats through. So if you take a look at the picture in the top right, this is a factory literally built right on a canal. And it's made so that it's easy to bring the raw materials in and take the goods produced in the factory and ship them out. So that's really important. Don't forget, Britain is also an island nation. So when it comes to transporting goods, across the ocean or to the continent, I mean, Britain has an amazing navy. It makes it very easy to ship goods all over the world. Finally, if you see in the bottom right, later in the Industrial Revolution, Britain will start developing railroads. And you're going to start seeing railroad lines go all through Britain. And also they're going to bring the railroads to their colonies. And again, that's another way to make it much easier to get the raw materials out of the colonies and take the manufactured goods produced in the colonies and bring it to the manufactured goods produced in Britain, in the mother country, and have those goods sent to the colony to be purchased. We're going to look at that relationship between these countries that are going through industrialization, these colonial powers, and their colonies. We're going to look at that again when we do an upcoming lesson on imperialism. But there's a big relationship between industrialization and the need and demand for colonies. All right. And that's another lesson we're going to do. All right. Finally, we're going to look at the issue of political support. Now, again, it's a huge, huge, big, wide world. And yet the Industrial Revolution starts in this teeny tiny country. Now, one of the things that was great about Britain is, you may remember, they had their English Civil War. You had William and Mary sign the English Bill of Rights. And once that's done, things pretty much settle down. You have a very stable country, very stable government. So this is a good place to do business. You're not worried about, like France having, those poor, you think you want to open up a business during the, when France was going through its revolution, you're going to be worried about getting your head chopped off in the middle of the terror? No. So it's a very stable country. But in addition to being stable, the government is very supportive of business, like crazy supportive. They actually believe in something known as laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire capitalism means capitalism that is, the government is completely hands-off. So the government does not take any role in business. Their attitude is, if a British businessman is running his factory, you do you, baby. Whatever works, we're going to stay out of it. Now, again, very different than mercantilism. Mercantilism requires a lot of government intervention, a lot of rules, a lot of regulations. That had to do with the colonies. But when it came to the factories, the government is like, if it makes you money, go for it. Now, when I say go for it, I'm not kidding. I mean, like, you want to hire 5 and 6-year-old kids to work in your factory? Go right ahead. You want to pay them nothing or very, very little? Sure, there's no minimum wage, whatever they're willing to take. Oh, you mean your factory ends up cutting fingers off of your employees, or your employees, after working there a couple of years, lose the ability to walk? Oh, well, stinks to be them. That's fine. Like, I'm talking no rules or regulations at all. No safety protections for the workers, no minimum wage, no standards as far as how old workers had to be, nothing. As long as you found somebody who's willing to do the work, that was good enough for the country. So that's this, and we're going to talk about this more. This is based on this idea of capitalism that Adam Smith wrote in his book, Wealth of Nations. We're going to take a much deeper look at capitalism, at the theory of capitalism, and in the lifestyle that these workers had in a future lesson. All right. And that is it. Oh, wait. I forgot our friend with the horn. I forgot the unicorn. I think pretty unicorns are really cool. No, I mean it. I think pretty unicorns are really cool is the mnemonic that's going to help you remember all the reasons why the Industrial Revolution begins in Britain. So Inventions like the seed drill, like the mechanical reaper, like the steam engine, like the, all that, or the textile mills, factories. T, transportation. You've got rivers, canals, railroads, ocean access. P, political support. Don't forget, England practiced laissez faire capitalism. That means the government hands off when it came to business. U, well, that stands for urbanization. That's that process where all of the agricultural workers left the farms and started moving into the cities. A, agricultural revolution. Don't forget, before you can industrialize, you have to have a sufficient food supply. R, raw materials. Britain has coal, iron ore, rivers, ocean access in its own country. In addition, it can also get raw materials from its colonies. And finally, C, well, that's the commercial revolution. Brand new ways of doing business, all kinds of financial tools help Britain grow into an industrial powerhouse. And with that, you are all done. Best of luck. See you in class.